Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third in our interview series for #Zero Waste Action Month. We are really excited to have, and we hope that you enjoy the talk that we're having today about compost, carbon sequestration, and the climate. We have our experts here who will introduce themselves shortly. But first, we are Race to Zero Waste, and I am Hayden Sloan, the Strategic Director of Communications, and my pronouns are she, her. So hopefully you all enjoy the chat that we have for y'all today. And let's get started. I'll pass it over to Danny to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danny, or Daniella Menendez, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator with Race to Zero Waste. Work with Hayden on Zero Waste Action Month, and I'm excited about today's conversation. It's a really cool, really in-depth look into composting, and it's really exciting. So glad y'all can make it. And my pronouns also are she, her.
All right, thanks. And I'll pass it off to our guests to introduce themselves. If you could say your name and your pronouns and what you're working on these days. Kevin, you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Kevin Drew. I currently work with the Department of Environment for the City of San Francisco, even though I'm retired. But I worked there for more than 20 years, and I worked for 15 years before that in the City of San Francisco, helping to run recycling programs and kind of help get a lot of these projects off the ground. And it's great to see them reaching a level of maturity that we can talk about things like carbon sequestration and the climate. As our little work, picking up bottles and cans and doing the right thing with our food scraps can have a big impact all the way up to the global and climate level.
That sounds great. Thanks. All right, Darrell, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Darrell Frey. I'm based in Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area. I was an organic farmer for 25 years, and I composted tons of horse manure every year, every week actually, for my farming. But now I'm a sustainable community development / permaculture consultant, mostly working with urban farms and with homeowners to help design their homes and landscapes. And I look forward to learning a lot from Kevin during this conversation.
That sounds great. Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to hearing about soil restoration and how you help folks out through the landscape design.
Well, I'm really excited to have Darrell here because it's the practitioners in the field, the literal field, that really are where the work that we're trying to do in cities needs to make a difference. And if it's not making a difference there, then there's some course correction that we need in our cities. And that's kind of exactly the point we're at, Darrell. About 25 years. We've been composting for 25 years. We've composted 2.5 million tons of organics that we've collected in the city, and we hope to God we've done the right thing with it. I think we have by making it into compost, and that's a huge kind of sea change for the recycling movement that I was a part of in 30 and 40 years ago, where we focused a lot on bottles and cans and newspaper. And then over time we shifted. I came into the movement as a bottle and can guy, and I've really become totally fell down the organics rat hole, because it's where we all fall eventually. And we all just kind of go down that hole and become part of the earth again. And the imbalance that we've discovered, and then again, Darrell, I'd like to hear your thoughts about, in your personal experience, in your, in the soil near where you are in your region, what's your experience of that, and how does compost help? And, it's a place where we can make an enormous difference, kind of like almost immediately, because if you garden at all, or you are connected to the soil, you can see literally in a day, a sprout come up. I've got zucchini that are growing like crazy, and I swear sometimes they grow 3 inches in a day. And that's carbon sequestration. That's the carbon cycle working. So, I mean, Darrell, tell us a little bit more about what compost has done for you, and why you do it, and you know what I mean, and do others do it is it a common practice in Western Pennsylvania?
In Pittsburgh, my friend Nancy Martin, she teaches compost education. They've given out thousands of compost bins. she has classes. Before the pandemic, she'd get 40 or 50 people at each class, every month in different municipalities. But so there's a lot of home scale composting. And some of the urban farms I work at and consult with, they have compost bins set up, and their customers come and bring their household waste to put in their compost bins. So Pittsburgh has a pretty good track record. Years ago, a friend of mine that worked for the Pennsylvania Resource Council had to go to a court case. The neighbors thought one of the compost bins was drawing rodents, and the magistrate at the hearing was a composter.
Good deal.
Does it have a screen? Is it fastened to the ground? Well, then it's no problem. So, Pittsburgh's pretty well advanced as far as that goes. In my own life, actually, I built a large solar greenhouse, and we included compost chambers. And during the winter months, every month we would put in a dump truck load of compost into the compost bins, and then blow the waste heat and carbon dioxide into our soil to help enrich the growing environment, and then use the finished compost on the farm. So we were removing nutrients from a stable that otherwise would have been piled and going into a natural lake, the runoff, composting it and adding it to our farms to enrich the soil, to build carbon in the soil, and to grow produce.
And that's a beautiful, circle that you can see yourself, in sort of your daily life. And then I'm from the Northeast. I'm from Albany, New York, and so I know my mom was a gardener, and she used to take me to the greenhouses when I was a kid. And in the winter in upstate New York, it's kind of like the winter in Western Massachusetts or Western Pennsylvania. Very, very, very similar. And it'd be warm, and you could tell that the greenhouse was working, which is interesting because that's an example. That's a demonstration of the greenhouse effect, which is what, on a large scale, we've managed to do to the whole planet without as much care as Darrell was describing about how they would take the organics from the farm or from the horse ranch and utilize it not only to make compost, but to make heat in the winter. Which you need. We don't need it in California, but we certainly need it in Northeast. And then make a product that you then turned around, and when the spring came, you had it ready to go. That's that kind of very, very straightforward, almost simple, but it's not simple. It just involves a lot of tasks that anyone can do. It's great to hear. I mean, Pittsburgh is one of those towns that, like most cities, has a very active a group of activists who are active on environmental issues or garden issues or climate issues, and at the same time it's Pittsburgh. They got folks who don't pay any attention, folks who don't care, folks who
just like every city.
Yeah, just like everywhere. I mean, it's so funny to find, almost, you scratch the surface in any city and you will find a core of folks that maybe they're talking to others, maybe they're just doing it themselves. And
that actually brings us to one of the questions that we kind of want to talk about, is this difference between, Darrell mentioned a lot of folks in Pittsburgh compost at home, and that's great, and they have a place to take it to. What is that distinction between at-home compost and maybe more industrial compost? I think San Francisco has a pretty big industrial composting through Recology, if I'm not wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting story too, because I was involved when we started. We had something called the San Francisco League of Urban Gardeners, SLUG. It was formed in the late 70s when the environmental movement was starting up, and Danny knows some of the people. Steve Sherman, I think he was on the board way back when. Mohammed Nuru, who's been in the news lately, was the executive director for many years, and it was just a group of people who really wanted to urban garden, and as a function of that, they did composting. We had a very robust community gardens, and still do in San Francisco. Had about 50 way back, in the 70s. It's probably 150 different gardens now, with a good 50 of them being at schools. And most community gardens have some sort of composting associated with it. It works to greater and lesser degrees as you find kind of the enthusiasts who likes the composting or likes the gardening part. and you kind of need both. But we had that, and we spent quite a bit of time in San Francisco, the solid waste management program in the 70s and 80s, supporting backyard composting. We gave away composters, we had classes, we built something called the Garden for the Environment, which is it's just had its 30th anniversary last year. It's a wonderful place, not far from where my 3 kids were born in San Francisco. And it helped people compost in their homes or in their backyard or in their local garden. Then 30 years ago, around 30 years ago, is when we started experimenting with what I would call front yard composting, which is putting a green bin in front of your house that could collect the material that you didn't have a way to process easily. Either you didn't care to, or you didn't take you weren't technically oriented towards composting, and you could collect yard waste, tree branches, food waste. Most people used it for yard waste first, but it took a while for them to catch on to put the food in it. And it took a while for us to catch on to the point where we needed bigger and bigger and more sophisticated industrial composting. Our program was started working with the restaurants. We didn't start with homes. We started with restaurants where the concentration of food was. But after 4 or 5 years of that, we spread it gently to the rest of the city. And first we had 1 route that did the whole city, and then 2 and 3 and 4. And now we have a green route with every black route or every blue route. In other words, it's equalized, and people are creating not the same amount, but each vehicle has an efficient route that combines these different materials.
That's a really interesting distinction. I think maybe it's not something that we think about very often with compost, is that we have our household waste compost, but then you also have yard waste compost, which there are some places that might have yard waste pickup, but then they don't have household waste pickup because they're just different systems. Yeah. And then of course, restaurant compost is a whole other world, not to mention supermarket compost. But I want to pass it off to Darrell to hear his answers to these questions.
As an organic farmer, compost has a very well-defined definition by the EPA, and that's that the material is heated to probably 140 degrees minimum and turned 5 times in 15 days. Whereas your household compost is more of a slow breakdown and aging. And if you're putting animal manures in there, then you get worried about E. coli, and suddenly you're really needing it to age a year, or you're needing to get it up to those temperatures. So if you're a commercial, just to repeat, if you're making compost to grow food to sell, then really you should be making sure that it gets hot. So there's different, so composting from the organic agriculture point of view specifically is mesophilic. The bacteria create the heat, and that kills pathogens. And so I think probably what Kevin's doing with commercial, they probably have to make sure that it gets heated to that temperature. Whereas the average backyard homeowner with their compost bins, they're not getting that temperature, but they need some education on how long it has to age, how to use it. So that's basic difference between 2 types of compost. Yard waste you can add to either one. You want to balance your carbon nitrogen, of course, when you're making compost. But so again, commercial versus home backyard, you can do different things.
And I think that's why things like the friend you were talking about in Pittsburgh, who leads those kind of classes, helps people understand that, how long to let it sit, how to turn it. That's the kind of things at the Garden for the Environment that our department has funded them consistently over those 30 years. And they teach, there's a more active there's the drum kind of turning. It's much speedier from a processing standpoint. I'm not sure if it reaches a higher temperature. I'm not a good enough composter to really understand the ins and outs of it. That's something that actually my daughter and I are planning on starting our own bigger compost operation than we've had here. And basically what we've got is just a pile that sits for like a year, and then we do something with it. It's not active in any real sense, but obviously something's going on in that pile because it does turn into something different than what we started with.
Yeah, that's a great composting method. That's the composting method that I used when I lived in Pittsburgh. It's the low maintenance, super easy. Like you don't have to think about it. You're just going to throw things in a pile. But now I live in an apartment. So if my city doesn't have composting, which recently they started a pilot program for composting, which I'm super excited about, but they limited the number of keys that people could get to be able to put their household waste into the compost bin. I think they also did it to be able to monitor and to see like who has the key, what kind of waste is ending up in the bin, to see if it's viable as far as the education that they've put out goes. But I wasn't able to get a key. Like, what do I do in my apartment? So yeah, that's been a complication. Do y'all have any advice for apartment composting? Like, what should we do?
Well, that's actually interesting. That's where guerrilla composting comes in, which is in cities. When we first started a program and we had it at restaurants, people in the neighborhood got crafty and figured out that they would, when it got put out, they just walk over and put their stuff in at the night, that night or the following morning before the truck came around. And we actually recommended that, and actually the city of New York adopted that for apartment buildings in part like Greenwich Village and places where they started a program like you're describing, not the whole city, but like a chunk. And it only was for like restaurants or food service places that subscribe to it. But then they actively embrace the guerrillas instead of saying, trying to keep them away. They said, no, if you know that there's someone down the street that is doing it, please introduce yourself and tell them what you're doing, then do it. And now that was like probably almost 20 years ago, at least 10 years ago. And it's interesting because I've heard that during the pandemic that the city of New York kind of like just stopped all the various composting gigs they had going. And I know they were trying pretty hard. And actually some of the bigger apartment complexes have been built with a third stream involved. And I think I'm hoping that those ones are still continuing, because there it was not a matter of kind of what was happening on the ground. It was more a matter of, was there a system inside the building that managed the waste in the proper ways? Because once you get it separated, there are places for it to go. I don't think those models changed. I don't know how the pandemic has affected programs in Pittsburgh, if there's any experience in that way. Hayden, do you know?
In Pittsburgh, I don't know, but maybe Darrell does. Let's pass it off.
Yeah, I don't think it's really affected. The city doesn't collect compostable waste, so I don't think it really affected much, except that the classes that Pennsylvania Resource Council teaches are online, and then people used to go to a location and there'd be 40 bins for the participants to take home. Now they have to meet individuals to hand out bins at central locations. But and the urban farms I'm involved with, they didn't really slow down when we were composting. So I don't think there's anyone specifically taking restaurant waste in Pittsburgh yet. I know there's been pilot programs that people have, quantified how much was there, and some vermicomposting people have, tried some of that collection. I'm not sure how far it's developed, but back to the apartment dweller, vermicomposting is an option to explore. A small bin in your house with the red wiggler worms, and putting your waste in the worm bin, or finding a local farm or community garden nearby. Actually, where I'm living right now, we have a compost bin, but we do very little composting because we have 5 chickens, and so the chickens get 90% of the household waste, and that we get 4 to 5 eggs a day, and most of the year, and they're very eager to have our kitchen scraps.
Yeah, my dad has chickens too. Go ahead, Danny.
I was just going to ask Darrell, do people bring their residential food scraps or maybe commercial food scraps from businesses and stuff to the urban farm or to the farms out in Pittsburgh at all? Or local community gardens?
Yeah, the main farm I'm involved with, Garfield Community Farm, they collect coffee grounds from several cafes. And they're a project of a church, and some of the volunteers go every week and pick up the coffee grounds and tea grounds from a couple of cafes in the neighborhood. That's one point I wanted to get to eventually here, is the scale of things. That in cities with apartment dwellers, it's very important to have some centralized collection options. But in a city like Pittsburgh, it's mostly neighborhoods. Just having that, keeping things at a scale that can be managed, that people can get to an urban farm. As a permaculture consultant, I have a theory that everyone doesn't have to garden, but everybody should know a gardener, and there should be a market garden in every neighborhood. So, and these market gardens would, definitely places you can bring your compost, bring your cardboard for mulching if it's not being recycled. And I do some property management, and anytime I have furniture or things, got a lot of extra cardboard. There are bins where we can take it to be recycled, and the styrofoam, there's a recycling place in Pittsburgh, but a lot of times I take the cardboard to the urban farm because they use it to mulch their fruit trees and mulch new gardens. So, just besides growing food and education, there's a lot of services that small scale urban farms can do.
I love that idea. I wish we had more urban farms. Sorry, Danny, I keep interrupting you. Go ahead.
I was just gonna bring up the point that it's really interesting to hear the two distinctions of the two cities, because the system that Pittsburgh has, San Francisco can't have that, right? So it's really important to remember that each city is vastly different and has different needs in terms of collection of compost. And then I really want to get into the carbon sequestration talk, but Hayden, I know you had a little point you wanted to add, so go.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was just going to say it's really interesting, the multidisciplinary approach to this zero waste idea. So we have it's not just compost, right? It's also urban farms, or getting schools involved, or getting restaurants involved. Zero waste, as we see, is not just one concept, but rather a whole system. And so to our audience members, right, one Zero Waste Action Month thing that you can do is kind of start to get knowledgeable about maybe some of these systems. You can learn more, and just learning is a Zero Waste Action Month action. And then we also have to start composting or advocate for composting, like me. I'm gonna write to my town and say, I support this composting initiative. When you open it up to have a key available, please give me one. So that would be really great. And hopefully our audience members are kind of motivated to start some of those things. Like a church group. A church group is a great way to get involved as well in composting or urban farms. There's no reason why a church property can't also be a farm. But I'll stop there, and let's shift gears just slightly and talk about the concepts of drawdown and carbon sequestration. So they sound like big words, but we're going to have some great explanations, I'm sure.
Also, if we can talk about the link between composting and carbon sequestration, why are those two grouped together? Kevin, do you want to start with that?
It's interesting what Darrell said about you don't have to be a gardener, you just have to know a gardener. That's incredibly liberating, because I feel like a bad gardener, but I don't mind hauling dirt and turning this and weeding and kind of the stupid things that you have to do, but not being like the brains behind it. I don't know, somehow my dad was the gardener. He just made me do all that stuff, and I got good at that. My mom was a gardener too, growing flowers, and I didn't understand that they're just coming from carbon. All the carbon, we are carbon-based life forms. All the carbon that we interact with has come out of the atmosphere into a plant and then become available to us, or to the cow, or to the to the wheat that we then eat. And so all of that energy, the energy from the sun, the energy from the soil, from the water, the different pieces that are they're chemical bits that get put together in that plant and then grow. Danny has seen the incredible display of calla lilies that I have every year from my front yard. There's just thousands of them grow. I bring them into the office because it's you got to do it. There's a zillion of them, and they they were just carbon. They were just in air molecules. Like it happens in a very short period of time when they go from nothing to something in the spring. And it's so dramatic that is what motivates me to feel that helping to mobilize the soil to draw carbon down is one of the best climate actions that we can come up with. You can do it everywhere. You can, I mean, no matter how small, even grass is doing that. And as a matter of fact, grass is one of the things that not necessarily every type of grass that we grow in suburban lawns all over the world, but maybe there are some grasses that are more perennial that would be better used, and there are people that are starting to popularize those. So something as simple as a lawn, something slightly more sophisticated as a garden. When you get into pasture and you get into rangeland, you start to have really large chunks of acreage of soil that are just really waiting to be treated better than they have been. And if we were just a little more loving and a little more thoughtful, that we could begin to sequester substantial amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's work that's been done here in California in the Marin Carbon Project. Marin County is the county just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. And it's actually a very rural county, the western half of it. Lots of dairies, and western Sonoma County connects with that. I live in Sonoma County, just north of Marin. And it's all, if you go to the west from my house, I can point you out the window here, it's nothing but pretty much rangeland, open space for cows and sheep and other grazing animals, lots of deer. And when the Marine Carbon Project did a close study of it, they found that even though they are biogeochemists from UC Berkeley didn't think it would happen, some of the agronomists and composters in the group felt that if they treated soil right, they could actually increase the soil carbon content of the soil. That is, they could get more carbon out of the atmosphere that would stay in the soil. That Darrell could tell you about what the carbon content of soil, how much difference it makes when there's more carbon in there. When there's more carbon in there, there's usually a lot more other things there because the carbon is attractive to things to eat the carbon, things to kind of connect with the carbon to create their own body, their own different carbon chains. And it's just a wonderland of activity that's spurred on by the mycorrhizal fungi that are in there, the mushrooms and all those little tentacles that are looking for something to do. And carbon is what it is that they want. So getting the carbon out of the atmosphere into the ground starts off a chain reaction that creates it creates life. I mean, without it, we wouldn't exist. Without it, we wouldn't have oxygen in the air to breathe. I mean, it's the basis of the whole kit and caboodle here. What the Marine Carbon Project science found was that at first they put a ½ inch of compost down on rangeland one time, then they stepped back to see what would happen. What they found was there was anywhere from 1 to 10 tons of additional carbon sucked down into that land, a land being a hectare, not an acre, a hectare. They're doing it in metric terms. So that's about 2.5 acres. So anywhere from ½ ton to 5 tons of carbon would go into an acre, putting it and translating it to kind of US terms in 1 year from that, just from the stimulation of what the carbon did to that soil.
That's amazing.
They did it in West Marin and in the kind of landscape there. They also did a matching experiment in the foothills of California, which is, if you're familiar with San Francisco and you drive up to Yosemite, you go through a vast region. The gold country is really those foothills. And it's not prairie, it's rangeland, which is actually quite lush. It can be grazed, it often isn't. And it's suitable for putting this kind of compost on. California has something like 400 million acres of rangeland like that. We could be doing this compost treatment on, let's say even half of that, because it's the right slope and it's close enough to where people are and where farms are and where composters are.
Talking about the landscape is really interesting because Pittsburgh has a vastly different landscape, being so hilly.
Yeah, right. The hills. Yeah.
I would love to hear from Darrell about his perspective, to see how things are with soil and land restoration, and drawing down that carbon into the soil, with particular regard to your organization, which is Three Sisters Permaculture, which comes from indigenous knowledge. And I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, the name Three Sisters was my farm and it's my permaculture consulting. Most Native Americans and out into Mesoamerica and South America grew, their main crops were corn, beans, and squash, which they grew as companion plants. So they would chop up whatever weeds, make a little mound in their gardens, and then plant their corn and beans. And then when the corn grows, it's trellis for the beans. And then they'll plant squash around it a week or so later. When the squash grows, they're hilling it up and chopping the weeds as they go. And then when the squash gets so big, then it's shading out to this mound. And so it doesn't need weeded much anymore. And so it was the corn, beans, and squash grown together yield more food, per area than they would separately. And it's a mini ecosystem. So that's inspired my farm name. As far as agriculture, a couple terms to be keeping in mind is carbon farming. A colleague of mine, Eric Hohensmeyer, wrote a book called Carbon Farming Solution, I believe it's called, and it talks about different regenerative agriculture techniques to help, how you work your farms to sequester carbon instead of burning it up. And, intensive gardening, we would put on 2 inches of compost a year into the soil, and a lot of that gets absorbed by the plants and used up, and you have to keep adding it, keep sustaining it. It does, some forms of the carbon stay in the ground and build up a bit of reserve, but some of it is used by the plants, broke down microorganisms to create gardening. So, intensive annual vegetable gardens requires this constant input, whereas perennial gardens, mulch gardens, and a lot of regenerative agriculture techniques are being developed specifically to make sure you're storing the carbon in the ground. So there's a certain conscientiousness required of the farmer. Another thing I like to teach and remind people of, I'll say that sustainable communities are going to look more like 1910 than 2010. And there's a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries about the agriculture in China, Japan, and Korea in 1906. And all this organic matter is brought into cities, all this food, restaurant waste, processing waste, household waste. And then if it's put into the waste stream and goes to landfills, then it's creating methane, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas. But in 1910, people would take the horse manure from the horse-drawn carriages and take their waste back to the farms. They'd feed pigs, they'd feed chickens, they'd compost it. And there was, as Christopher Alexander talks about in his book of Pattern Language about how to create sustainable communities, there should be interlacing fingers of countryside and urban areas that interconnect so that everyone should be within 20-minute drive up to a farm, and the farms can reuse the compost. So again, what we're aiming for is to create this sustainable future, sustainable present that has these connections, that takes these organic materials back from out of the waste stream and uses them in the city or in the surrounding countryside to complete this cycle.
Yeah, and that brings us to that circular thinking, and that's how we achieve zero waste, is through that circular economy. And that actually brings me to a question that we got from our Facebook audience, in that, do you think that your respective cities are doing enough really to keep those food scraps and organics out of landfill, like you said, Darrell, out of the waste stream? Is there anything that you would maybe like to see improved, or something that we as citizens can advocate for to help get that waste out of the landfill?
Yeah, there's, in the long run, it has to be profitable for somebody, or pay people for the time. The logistics I'm sure Kevin can speak a lot more to this than me, but the logistics of, the city of Pittsburgh hasn't been collecting organic waste, composting them. Different municipalities within Allegheny County, there's like 130 collect the yard waste and leaves, and then those are composted and made available to people, but household food isn't. So, how to set up a system that's either supported by the community, that they're willing to have the city invest in it, or how to make it profitable. I'm not quite sure we're there yet in Pittsburgh.
That's an interesting point, Darrell. I think we sort of stumbled into this. Honestly, we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, we did, but we didn't. I'm part of the system that oversees the trash and recycling system in the city of San Francisco. And so we're responsible for getting it picked up and getting it out. And we have a company, Recology, that actually has, through their crafty deployment of Italian knowledge, owned all 97 permits that there are in the city of San Francisco for the 97 routes that were created back in the 1920s, basically to do what Darrell was just describing, how to make sure that the stuff that people were using got back to where it went. And at that time, they were washing every bottle, they were saving all the rags, they were mostly feeding the organics to other animals. But over time, they ended up with something that had to go further because it didn't have a home. And we ended up combining all of that for a period of time. And then basically in the last 30 years, we've started to pick it apart, bottles and cans and paper, but also organics. And the question was the cost, like how do you make it profitable? For the city, there's a certain cost associated with moving the material around. There's trucks, there's fuel, there's labor. Labor is the biggest piece by far. It's like 60% of our cost of our waste system. Our waste system in San Francisco costs about $350 million to do every single thing from residential, commercial, soup to nuts. And that's that $350 million. Of that, we collect it all, and then we determine where it goes. And some of it goes to composting. We are getting about 60 to 70% of the organics in the stream, in our total stream, we're capturing. We know that. We do waste characterization studies, and we're trying to figure out how to get that last 20 to 30%. That's a big challenge for us. And now we have different markets for that. That old feed market that Darrell was talking about has kind of slipped away because for public health issues, they don't do it so much anymore. But it's still viable when you go outside the city to a smaller city. There'll be a pig farmer who comes in and picks up the food scraps from a restaurant still, because that is the most efficient use of that food. But for us, making that profitability work, it costs about our compost program with $350 million that we start with. We sell all the compost that we make for about $3.5 million, which is 1% of the $350 million. So you got $350 million, you shrink it all down to the compostable aspect of it, and it's about 1%. If we were to give that compost away to farmers for that 1% change in our rates, would we be able to direct that compost in a way that helped the city offset all of its carbon emissions and create a food that comes back to the city, to its residents, in a way that is, sustainable and recognizable, and sort of closing that loop that you were talking about, the circular economy. It's really more complex than circular. It's really like a amoeba moving around, and more like the right mycorrhizal fungi operating on all different levels at the same time. But it's there, and it needs to be recognized, and it needs to be funded. The other piece of my work is bottles and cans. And it's still, if we put a 1 cent addition, 1 to 2 cents on every bottle or can, we would have enough money to fund the entire system in a holistic way, to pay good wages, to have health care, to not throw the stuff in the wrong place. It's really shocking to find how little the marginal difference would make to create a system that is much more holistic than right now. It's kind of like, industry can get away with what they can. The city ends up being the place that has to handle it. And we try to do it as cheap as we can.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's a race to the bottom, not a race to the top.
And we want the race to zero waste.
Yeah, exactly.
So I like the idea that you said about the circular economy, that it's not just simply a closed loop. And actually the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has a graph that it's the butterfly diagram of the circular economy, because there are lots of inputs and outputs, and it just keeps going around in different ways. So sometimes it's for maybe manufacturing, or sometimes it's for compost, and things are used in different ways at different times, but it becomes more circular. Maybe not one closed loop for one product, but actually it's interacting with many other loops within the circularity.
Just like the compost heap is, and just like the gardens and the farms that Darrell talks about, and the complicated weaving of the Three Sisters, you end up with much more when you do it well.
Darrell, I'll pass it to you to make your comments now and maybe answer those questions.
Especially over the last 30 years, I've seen so much, good things happening with just like your organization, Race to Zero Waste. So Pittsburgh is full of amazing organizations. There's a group called Tree Pittsburgh that collects native trees and other seeds, and they grow out trees, 80 different species, and then sell them to nonprofits to plant in Allegheny County. There's just there's a lot of people rising to the call to fix things and save things. And the pandemic did create a lot more gardeners, and I don't know if they'll stick with it, but when I grew up, everyone was still growing the victory gardens that they got in the habit in the Second World War, and all my uncles and relatives and neighbors had a lot of gardens. And then whenever there's crises in society, people start becoming more aware of environmental issues or whatever, and start working together more. And there's a lot to be concerned about, but there's a lot of good things happening. And so, certainly one of my main focuses in my work has been, how do we get there's the victory garden, how to get that stream of organic matter coming into cities and getting it back to the land and not turning into methane. On my farm, we did a lot of outdoor composting through 6-9 months of the year, but with the indoor composting, we were catching some of that carbon dioxide to enhance the growing environment. In a greenhouse, if it's sealed up, it can use all the available carbon dioxide for photosynthesis by midday. And so supplementing carbon dioxide is important in greenhouses. How to scale up. Years ago, I sent a 6-page paper I wrote to Elon Musk trying to help him design their, I want a Tesla and you guys, and I help you design your Mars bioshelter. But it's kind of tongue in cheek, but I sent it in anyway, but I never got my Tesla or my job. But, I don't think going to Mars is the answer, but I think there is something about, cycling the carbon, trying to catch it in the land, catch it in plants, growing more plants to catch more of that carbon, getting more trees and old growth trees, and just and people are working on it, so it's gratifying to be part of that.
No, it's great that you're doing what you're doing, Darrell, and that's, I'm happy to have a role in the city where folks who aren't so connected to the community and to the gardens and to the permaculture that you're out there with, we just have to create that link so that there's a real, like Hayden, you were describing, and the butterfly thing, that's much more complicated than a simple back and forth, but you can just pick one little aspect of it and participate in that. I think, as you said at the beginning, that's what the action can be. There's so many actions. I think our model, we're trying to spread our model around. Both the state of California has actually made our system more or less required for almost all cities. And that's going to take a lot of work. We're going to need a lot of composters. We're going to need a lot of compost facilities. We're going to need good things to do with that compost. There's no lack of them. It's just a matter of still kind of directing them. And that's what your generation, Danny and Daniella, Danny and Hayden, have got to, you've got to do it. Just do it. And the funny thing is, actually pretty good fun, right? I mean, Darrell, you can do some pretty amazing things in a very small little, whether it's the garden, whether it's in the greenhouse in the winter, the dead of winter where you've got stuff growing because it's warm. Because I know how cold it is in Pittsburgh, and to have that little miracle happening in front of you, or out in the countryside where you see it too. It's absolutely something you can see, you can be close to.
I think that's a great note. And actually, we're coming to the end of our time, and you've kind of answered my last question, Kevin, which was, what's maybe one thing that our participants in Zero Waste Action Month could do? And that, like try and grow something is like one way to do it. And then the advocacy that we've already talked about as well. So I'll just give you both like 1 minute to say your, kind of closing comments. If there's one thing that people really should know about compost and the climate, what would you tell them to do?
Just one thing, Kevin.
Yeah, you compost your food scraps. I mean, that's what I use my little food composter in the kitchen, like 30 times a day. And I just put every little thing that goes in there, a little paper towel if I happen to use any, whatever that little scrap is when I'm sweeping up a floor or whatever. I mean, so much goes in it. And then for me, it goes into the green bin, but it's going to go into the yard garden soon enough. And that can make a difference right there.
Great. And Darrell?
Yeah. In my work, we talk a lot about connections and relationships. And so, find that right relationship with the, whether you have a potted plant and you're raising worm bins and you put some of that worm compost in your potted plants, or whatever your scale is. We talk about teach people to examine their own life, and you don't have to do everything. You don't have to knock yourself out to save the world. You just have to see what little things you can do to improve your situation, like an annual assessment, and how am I buying my food? How much waste is generated? Should I have a stock pot? Collect my celery stalk, left base and make soup stock and whatever. There's just so many different things you can do to reduce the waste stream, and then to make good use of it, and connect it with somebody who can if you can't.
I love that idea. Yeah. So getting into that community building, finding ways to reduce waste together, I think is a great way to end things. Danny, did you have any last thoughts before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank you both. I mean, this conversation is so interesting, and the limited knowledge that I have of carbon sequestration, I think there's just so much value to it. And if people really understood the value of composting their food scraps and the potential that it could have, and just the growth and impact that it can have. And I think, Darrell, you said it, let's not go to Mars. Let's restore what we have here on Earth and try to give back to it a little bit, give back to Earth and help restore and make it better. And that's through a simple act. What Kevin said is through composting, which is pretty amazing. Just putting your food scraps in a green bin or your backyard compost, or whatever, a community garden, whatever you have at hand. So it's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there are lots of resources online. We'll probably have a blog about composting. We have some about zero food waste. So if you're in the audience, please look into those. There's so many options for composting. So if you have a stable living situation, maybe I'll even try it, even though I feel a little intimidated about putting something on my balcony. I'll give it a shot, right? So let's all try and educate ourselves. And like we've said, if you don't want to compost, then maybe start a community garden or something to be able to, so that doesn't go to waste, and we'll close that loop on zero waste. So thanks everyone. Yeah. Oh, worm bin. Yes. All right. I'm looking into it officially. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for joining us again. Thanks from Race to Zero Waste. Thanks to our audience as well. And remember to post your actions for #Zero Waste Action Month. And we hope to see those soon. All right, everyone. Thanks.